Good day and welcome to another edition of Insight. You know, they say they are our future, but what about the present? How have we done in the past? The country is judged by how you take care of your children and your elderly, those at the far end of the spectrum of life, this life cycle thing, birth and death. How do we take care of those with special needs? We have, and we are delighted to have, the person who is the advocate, the children's advocate, Diahann Gordon Harrison. Welcome to Insight.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
You know, I knew another advocate before your time. What was her name again?
Mrs. Clark.
Mrs.
Yes.
Clark, what a beloved lady. How is she doing, you know?
As far as I know, she's doing well.
You'd never know a program would ever start like this, yes. But those who take care of our children are special people to us. Mm-hmm. But I want to know, what is the children advocate? What can you tell us? Give us an insight, if you may, as to what is your remit. Mm-hmm. Where do you start and where do you stop, if there's ever a stop?
All right. Well, first of all, let me say how delighted I am to be here with you, eminent broadcaster that you are, and really to be putting some focus and insight on what the Office of the Children's Advocate does, because there's a lot of mystery and a lot of confusion as to what on earth we do and who we are. So thank you. So first of all, we are a Commission of Parliament, which means that we are an independent authority that answers to no one minister in particular. We don't fall in a department or a ministry whereby there is a procedural order in terms of telling us what we examine, what we investigate.
So you're autonomous like that?
Yes, so we report to the Parliament as a whole, as do the other commissions of Parliament, for example, INDICOM, the former Office of the Contractor General, the Auditor General's Department, and the Public Defender. Those are the, commissions of Parliament. And it's very important that that distinction is known and observed, because what it means is that since the legislation, which is the Sheraton Protection Act, says that the Children's Advocate has jurisdiction even over agencies of the government and representatives of the government, to include ministers, members of parliament, permanent secretaries, etc., you can understand, for the perception of justice to be done, there has to be an unfettered discretion, whereby yes, the only thing that guides us is, one, was that child at the center of this matter? Two, was that child's rights breached in any way? Or three, were the actions taken in any way negative to the best interests of the child? So that really is what guides us. Okay,
let me ask you this, because you have this larger than life roaming opportunity to deal with, as long as a child is at the center. It gives you the right to go through. That's your subpoena. That's your search warrant. That's your everything, yes? But help me. I once saw a gentleman who became a judge, a Court of Appeal judge. He was a member of a political party and a minister one time. And I said, well, sir, when you're going there, it's going to appear as if you are one-sided. And he said to me, Michael, it's not about who hires you, it's who can fire you. Once I become this Court of Appeal judge, they can't fire me. And so therefore I get my, who can fire you? Well, what if I sit there and not doing our job well, and with all of these powers that you have to be able to go and supersede, who fires you? Who are you?
The commission is really issued by His Excellency the Governor General, and the legislation does in fact provide an avenue through which to get rid of me, if that becomes necessary. And it really has to be if there is no longer any confidence in my abilities to properly discharge the functions of the office, which of course would mean, I suppose, persons finding specific acts that would be looked at as evidence of my unfitness. And the process would have to go through, I think it is the Prime Minister and also the leader of the opposition, and then they would move a motion to His Excellency.
So it's similar to like a judge.
Yes, it is.
Who you can't just willy-nilly, if you go on like you're mad, yes, you can get rid of you, or if you just, dereliction of duty, you start going off the rails, what have you. Okay, so that's, we understand, so that's enshrined in such a way with some protection, legal protection.
And the legislation actually does say that the Children's Advocate's post is classified as that of a puisne judge, which is equivalent to a Supreme Court
The
judge.
amount of things we're learning this morning. I'm always fascinated by the word puisne judge. You know, they're not puny at all in terms of how we use the word. You keep speaking of this legislation, Child Care and Protection Act.
Yes, that's right.
When did this come about? What was the context of the time? Why did it come? And has it made a difference?
Absolutely. So the Office of the Children's Advocate, as you will see when I finish my little mini crash course this morning,
Yes.
is a direct result of the Child Care and Protection Act. And that has its genesis in the fact that Jamaica signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, the convention came about in 1989, so this year we're celebrating 30 years. And Jamaica, being, as I would always tell persons, we're very previous in Jamaica, so we do a lot of things first. We were the first Caribbean country to sign and ratify that convention a mere 2 years after it was promulgated. So we signed and ratified in 1991. What that means is that Jamaica is therefore a state party to this convention, and there are certain obligations that come with that state party status. So you have to ensure that your legislation mirrors the principles as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You have to ensure that you now have what is called a rights-based approach, which is that children are not just little offshoots that you do things for out of pity or as a by the way, but that children are in and of themselves rights holders with certain entitlements to life, protection, shelter, healthcare, education, all of these things. And so the Child Care and Protection Act came about in 2004 as Jamaica's legislative response to its state party status. And it really is what I call the omnibus legislation, if you will, that treats with all things children in Jamaica and makes it very clear and beyond debate that whenever you're treating with a matter that involves a child, whether you are a judge, whether you are a police officer, whether you are the head of a relevant authority, whether you're a teacher in school, it has to be that when you move forward to treat with this child, your first question, which is the guiding foundational principle, is, are my actions that I'm going to take in relation to this child, whether it be, creating laws or policy or so on, are my actions in keeping with advancing the best interests of the child?
Okay, let me see if I understand what's going on here, because it's important that my people wait a bit and give me a bit, and wherever they are can understand. You're saying that the United Nations in 1989 came up with a set of principles governing the rights of children.
Yes.
And Jamaica, in 2004,
No, in 1991 we signed and ratified.
1991,
Yes. And then in
ratified
2004.
that, meaning that we're going to support that. We believe in it.
Yes.
And we agreed that the laws that we are coming up with in 2000 and MASH,
Yes,
2004,
2004, yes.
should reflect. So in other words, the UN is like the constitution from which these other laws are coming.
Yes, on this particular
on
issue.
this thing.
Yes.
But what if we are ahead of the UN in terms of, because time takes over, and what if we have come out with even more enlightened things that the UN had agreed to at the time?
Yeah.
What do we do? Do we go back to them and say, change your thing, or?
No, we don't, but we have periodic reviews that the UN facilitates through its review and monitoring mechanism, which means that they check in with their states to say, how are you doing? How are you doing? And they send, if you have seen anything issued by the UN, a multiplicity of pages that we have to fill out in terms of different categories to talk about what are institutions like, what are they doing, what are our laws like, have we had any amendments, any updates, what are our policies, and all sorts of things to get a full pulse of what's happening with children on the ground. What I can tell you, and I'm very proud to share, is that we also have to appear before the committee at different points. This is the committee in Geneva now that will look at what really is happening, and it's the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is a UN body that monitors, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and how states parties are doing. And there was one year that Jamaica had the distinction of getting very special positive mention because none other than the Office of the Children's Advocate was recognized as a global best practice. So that's huge, because when you look at how the office is constituted, some persons in other jurisdictions do have similar named offices, but they're more ombuds-like. So they speak on issues, but they don't have, for example,
Direct.
the investigative authority that the Office of the Children's Advocate has to not only investigate, but also the legal authority to institute legal action against persons who have breached children's rights to get damages, money for them in court.
Yes.
So it's a peculiar animal.
Yes.
The office.
Where did this come from then? Is there somewhere else in the world there was precedent to this type of setup? That because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can always look at what. We are the first.
Being clearly innovators, we actually pulled from several different systems and fused it into one. So, for instance, we have the investigative power, which mirrors, on some instances, even the powers of a police constable, where we can go, a little girl, for example, has been raped, we can take the statement, assist with the medical examination, and take it all the way up to the point of the arrest. Then we have what are more civil investigative powers. So let's say it is an administrative matter that has led to a child breaking her leg. It's not a criminal matter where somebody can be charged, but we can say, hold on, there is some negligence here based on the circumstances. We're going to get all the details, file the pleadings, which would be, the notice of application for court orders, the affidavits, and so on, to institute a matter in the Supreme Court to get some damages for this child because of the injury that she has sustained. So we have that. Then we have as well what may be seen as the Attorney General-like functions that we exercise in relation to children matters. Because, for example, the Children's Advocate is supposed to and is entitled to, either when asked or on her own assessment that it becomes necessary, actually give advice to ministers, members of parliament, heads of government authorities that treat with children or provide services for them as to what are the proper steps you ought to be taking so as not to offend your children.
I will take a break on that, and I won't bring up the fact that she says her. I want to know if the Children's Advocate can one day be him. So far, our advocates have been hers, if you don't understand. But we'll be right back, because do children really have rights? And welcome back to Insight, the rights of the children. That's our discussion this morning, and the role that the Children's Advocate play. And we have her with us. Let's get past this gender issue. Is it a her position?
Absolutely not. I'm just saying her because I happen to be female.
Okay.
But it's really
and
just
the
a
person
competence
before
issue.
you was also
Yes.
the female.
Mere coincidence. I'm
Yes,
sure,
Sister Mary. You mentioned that even in civil action, that you come into play.
Yes.
Only recently I saw a serious thing at Clancarty. A garbage truck crushes a youngster. Was the Children's Advocate have any role to play in that? Has she played a role in that?
Absolutely. So the day after the incident happened, we were at the school on the compound for two primary purposes. One, to get information that we perhaps need to look at and consider in terms of what kind of process, if any, ought to be instituted to address any kind of violation of a right that may have occurred on the particular day. Of course, when we go in, it's a fact-finding mission at first. So we can't say, yes, we're going to take this action, because it depends on what we find. And secondly, to really commiserate with the rest of the school population, because this is a tragedy that we have lost a little one, 7 years old, and he has left behind a number of classmates and persons who would have known him, who are also children, who fall within our constituency, if you will. So yes, we have intervened. We have established dialogue with the relevant police officer who is leading the investigation. And I must say that the police have done a very thorough job, and we are cooperating and collaborating, right? So it's something that we are very much involved
Where does it go from here? Where does the process go from here? You're fact-founded, you're policed, checked up, Where do we go from here? What can that mother and that stepfather and even father hear from you to say, well, can't bring him back, but
Yes.
do something for me?
Yes, all right. All right, so certainly in terms of the criminal aspect of it, the police, through their investigations, have determined that criminal charges are in fact to be placed, and those have in fact been instituted against the driver of the motor truck. As far as we're concerned, we wouldn't seek to duplicate that because you can only be found guilty once. But certainly in terms of the civil aspect of things, there is room, and we are in fact doing that assessment to consider whether any civil proceedings should be instituted against perhaps not only the driver, but the owner of the vehicle and any other persons who may be vicariously
Ministry of
liable.
Education, maybe?
Possibly, but as I said, we're in assessment mode, so until we file that claim, I won't say specifically who are the parties that we would consider as likely respondents to the legal action, if it is that we're going that particular route.
On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest and the most likely, where are we in terms of civil action?
A 6.
A 6.
Yes.
So that's...
And the outcome of that, once the court finds in our favor, would be that whatever damages are recovered would be passed on to the family. Certainly, we do not retain fees to say, okay, so an award of 3 million was made, so you'll get 2.6. So whatever is received in the form of damages would be handed over to the parents, not with anything at all that this is equivalent to the value of life and the vibrancy and the love that this child would have brought, but even symbolically to say that this was a grave wrong, the worst has happened, which is death. It can't bring him back, but this is what we have been able to obtain on your behalf.
I want to still go there a little further because I want to know how the maths is done. Chances are, for an adult, you could say he would have earned X amount of certain amount of years. Let's do this by 2, 3, 4, 5. A 7-year-old, just full of potential. Precedent is what dictates,
Yes.
that guides,
Yes.
not dictate, but guides
Yes.
you on this issue.
Yes.
So what kind of settlement, and we're not settling the case here, please, for no reason at all anybody go and said anybody going to get any money. But I just want to get a sense of, since you don't have the potential earning, what is it that you work with?
Okay. All right, so generally there is a framework that we look at assessment of damages in, and it's all legal, right? It's drawn from precedents, it's drawn from similar circumstances, perhaps in other jurisdictions. It looks at a number of factors. So the age of the victim, it looks at the gender, it looks at perhaps if the victim had expressed any intentions as to what he or she would have become and so on. But generally, the threshold for damages for children is usually much lower than for somebody who is in the prime of his life, who is working, who is contributing, and so on. And so I can't say what that amount would be, but it really just depends on when we look at all the factors that will come forward and will be pleaded in the affidavits. The court would advise itself on what is a reasonable quantum, and of course we would ask for that, what we consider reasonable, given all the circumstances as well, once we file the action.
Yes. What are the rights of children? Because there are many of us who grow up, and some people still grow up this way, that a child should be seen and not heard. Now, when you read this UN thing, you talk about children have rights to religion. Children have rights to this. You must listen to them. But may I pay the bill? I mean, what do you mean? First of all, give me a sense of when we say children. Are we talking about 1 to 17, 1 to 16, 1 to 13? Give me what your cutoff is.
Sure. So the legal definition for children in Jamaica is anyone under 18 years. So once you celebrate that 18th birthday,
Done.
you have crossed the imaginary line into adulthood. I say imaginary because in theory, a lot of 18-year-olds still live with their parents. A lot of 18-year-olds, as was at the time, have no clue as to what life is about and being a responsible adult. So the definitive imaginary line is 18. Now, children do have rights. First of all, because they're people. the whole concept of this rights argument came about years ago because, and it obtains in relation to women as well. I'll tell you a very interesting development from Roman law. So back then, way back then, men were the only human beings that mattered, right? So men, when they took on a wife, it was seen as taking on an additional possession, if you will. And so women could be beaten and there was no problem because you have defied your husband. Women could be punished by means of all kinds of deprivation of privileges as the husband so determined. And if you're really bad, women could even be killed, right? Because the man is in charge. Now, of course, because the child is of the woman, the same kind of patronistic kind of paternal approach was taken, that children are really possessions, inanimate beings that are not capable of functioning with any cognitive skills or abilities, so we don't really listen to them because they're incidental, right? They're incidental to what we say and what we do. And because of the very great harm that was being done to children, some of them who were just left outside because, you know, you didn't really do what you're supposed to do and left to die, you know, there came the realization that this is flesh of my flesh. This is in fact a person that I'm dealing with. So historically, as women's rights evolved and women eventually got a voice, thank God, and we weren't, you know, automatically expected to be beaten by our husbands if we defied them, so too, centuries later, came the recognition that, you know, probably children really do have feelings and they're entitled to food, and if they're ill, they're entitled to health care, and, you know, we need to make them a little bit more than just you know, beings that have feeling but can think, so we perhaps have to expose them to an education and all these things. And so the basic fundamental rights that all human beings have are what the Convention on the Rights of the Child have identified as rights that children have. So for example, we say that children have the right to life. They have the right to be protected because they're vulnerable. They're not adults. They can't make sensible decisions. They have the right to an education so that they can develop and eventually achieve their full potential. They have the right to reasonable health care consistent with their age and their needs. And that includes the proactive health care, like being immunized so that they don't, you know, become susceptible to things that can be prevented if you have immunization. Going to a hospital if they have a very serious injury instead of just living with home remedy or what the Obia man says. You know, so all these things that really are looked in a way at coalescing around the well-being
of the child. But help me, the child have no earning power. The child has to depend on parents. The child has to depend on government for these things. We take up, you know, the hospital for children here. Well, recently we had a you know, brouhaha there going on, but this goes on every day, you know. It's just because people know people. That's why it make media and splash. But it goes on there every day. What about the right of government to provide for children? Ought there not to be the balance? Because if the children have right to medical attention, to health, therefore, we should point out that the rights of children are being undermined.
Yes, they can be said to be undermined in a number of ways. And while we have made significant strides, you know, from the 80s through to the 90s into the 2000s, there have been gains. We still have a far way to go. And that's why when we started the program, I said to you, we have these periodic reviews that we have to do because we're getting a lot right. For example, when you talk about breastfeeding now, we have had a very successful breastfeeding program through the Ministry of Health because we recognize the benefits for the newborn and so on, and we're way up the curve with that. Immunization, again, bedside registration, I'm sorry.
For
for the fathers and for the birth certificates, that's way through the roof. So we have a lot less of undocumented children without birth certificates and so on. So we've made some strides. But then what of some of the other issues that continue to dog us? The issue of violence against children.
We're going to come back with that when we come. Violence, there's no way we could do this program without the issue of violence against children. OMG, missing children. Even Nanda alert. Where is Ananda? You know, these are the kinds of stuff that reminds us that we have a long way to go. And we'll be right back on Insight. Welcome back to Insight. Dan Harrison is our special guest. We're talking about the rights of children and the right to live in a violent-free society. I suspect is one of the rights. That's where we left off. I suppose that on that issue we're not doing so well.
Absolutely.
Violence against our children.
Absolutely. The numbers are staggering. Some may say depressing, which would be an accurate description. And they're rising. When we looked at the 11-month period last year and compared it with this year, we have 3 additional deaths that are attributed to the murdering of our children. If my memory is serving me correctly, we had 37 for this 9-month period last year. We're now at 40. And that's murder, not accidental death, but murder, which of course, you know, is legally defined as the deliberate and intentional act to deprive life.
And this is for people under
18
years
Yes.
old. We've had 40. How do we compare with other countries, our size?
Right, we're high, we're very high. And I've only just mentioned the murders because, you know, there are other acts of violence. The sexual abuse figures are staggering. The physical abuse, as in non-sexual physical abuse, staggering. And the numbers continue to be very huge. The most, I think, disturbing aspect of the statistics, though, is that when you look at all the various categories, particularly of sexual and physical, it's people who know children who are hurting them. It's people who trust, you know, who have a trust dynamic with them, so the children trust them. And it's people who their parents and their families are very close to, right? Also very disturbing is the fact that children are often abused, in fact, predominantly abused in their safe spaces, so in their own houses where they live, in their community where they'll go to a community center, after school, in a coaching environment where it may happen in the gym or in a car park somewhere. So that for me remains the most disturbing fact when you look at the trends as relates to children and violence.
What we can do? What can we do as a society?
Right.
What can we do as individuals? What can we do? But that's just crazy.
Yes. All right. So I always tell persons that it has to be a number of interventions at the individual level and at the communal level that have to coincide if we're to get any kind of traction. First of all, we have to have frank discussions, not scary ones, because they have to be age appropriate, but frank discussions with our children. If they're very little, what is good touch, bad touch? What is your private part? It's the part if you're a girl where your swimsuit would cover if you're wearing a 2-piece. If you're a boy, it's that part that you use to go to the bathroom, so they understand that they have propriety over their own bodies.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if it is Uncle so-and-so who is doing it. It means that it's wrong in this context. The other thing we have to do is we have to empower them to speak, because the greatest weapon that the abuser has is the silence of the victim or the potential victim. They can continue to abuse and get away with it in silence if you keep silent. So we have to empower children to find that voice, to speak about things that are uncomfortable, or if they can't say it. Some children are very, you know, imaginative. Give them a sheet of paper, have them draw it. I've done cases like that where we couldn't use the child as a witness because he witnessed his mother's murder and he was 3 years old at the time, but he certainly drew it and assisted me in how I led that examination in chief of his older sisters, because he was able to give his account not through words but through a drawing. So we have to empower them. The other side of the coin is that, when they disclose, we as adults in their lives, we have to act. Don't say, foolishness, man, this is like from a movie. I have discovered, you see, that saying that we have about life mimicking art is not true. Art mimics life. Everything we see on a Lifetime movie has actually happened somewhere. So don't think it's too outrageous and it can't happen. So we're not going to rush to judgment, but listen to what the child has said and explore it, because it just may lead to a point where it singles out an individual who is interfering with that child. And then the other side of the coin is that when the authorities get the information, credible investigations have to be done, and they have to be done whereby we have all the material evidence. And in that regard, at the community level, because people always know something, when they're willing to talk on their verandas or talk to the neighbor about what they hear, they need to translate that casual talking to into communicating that to the police who are doing the investigations.
Let me ask that one. Let me bulldoze you on that one. A lot of people will see, hear, blind and deaf. Do we as individuals in the communities, this is at the communal level now where you are, have any business with that? Some ask Joan in picnicking them that a long time in my trouble him daughter. Do we as community people, and would that be accepted? Isn't that informing and fasten up your neighbor's business?
And informing is a very good way to go. We have recognized in the law, when it comes on to children, that we have to stand on moral authority and moral responsibility in relation to our children. And so the legislation is very specific. Section 6 of the Child Care and Protection Act says that it's a criminal offense if you have information that a child is being violated, abused in any way at all, and you keep your mouth shut. It's called failure to report. So the law is actually calling on us as members of society in our communities and our villages and our districts all across the island that we must talk what we know or what we suspect. It's not calling on you to prove anything, so you don't have to be right. But it says if you have information that suggests something is not so right there, disclose it so that we can check. Because what we're looking for is how best we can intervene in a situation to rescue a child who may be in a difficult and vulnerable situation.
You can move on suspicion?
Yes, yes. The difference though is that if you go in and the suspicion is not borne out, then of course there's no criminal case that can come of that. But if it is borne out, then great.
But what if you come in and it's not borne out? I can't sue you.
Absolutely not.
How come? What gives you that cover?
The legislation says that legally we're going to err on the side of caution if a child is involved. So it actually gives preemptive authority that if you suspect that something doesn't look right, you should go in and do something. I'll tell you a very interesting case. I got a call some time ago from a very concerned passenger who saw certain things unfolding at Norman Manley International Airport with a 2-year-old child who was given to a woman, and there were suspicions that it may have been child trafficking because of the circumstances that surrounded it and so on. And on that, we were able to preemptively ensure that she was pulled aside and that the relevant questions were asked, so that if it is that this were a case where a child was going to be,
moved out,
kind of subjected to a life of confinement and exploitation, we could have stopped it before it started.
How did it turn out? I'm curious.
Well, thank God, we traced the matter all the way to Atlanta.
Yes.
And when the questioning was done, it turned out that it was not, in fact, a case.
Okay.
So that one ended very well. But it makes sense when you're talking about people who are so vulnerable, because children sometimes, if you wait until after the act has been done or has been continuing for a long period, sometimes because of the trauma that they have been exposed to, by the time you get in, they can't even communicate to you definitively what has happened.
We don't have to go to Atlanta. I want to take you to St. James.
Yes.
Yahweh.
Yes.
You say children have rights to religion. The Constitution reminds me that we have a choice to go into any group we want to go into. Who authorizes and dares the authority to go and mash up the people in life as they saw fit to serve their God?
All right. I think the context of this one is a little bit different. Certainly, when I became aware of the matter, the first set of 3 children who were taken out of the
first set of 3 children.
Yes.
And we can run that video if you care, sir. Yes.
Right. So the first set of 3 that were taken out, I understand that specific complaints had been made to the authorities about the conditions that surrounded the lifestyle of those children. And so they were on the spectrum of being perceived as being in need of care and protection when it came on to food, where they were sleeping, exposure to the elements of the weather, not going to school, healthcare, and all these other things that we say we need as human beings to survive, right? And so on that basis, those children were removed, were placed before the court for the court to determine whether the removal was warranted or not. And the court did find that there was in fact concern about the proper care that was being attached upon those children, and so the children were removed from the compound by order of the court because of the concern. The second set were removed in much the same way.
Concerned relatives,
yes.
Okay, the first or three, and then others.
Right.
Yes.
Concerned relatives who raised issue with what was happening in relation to the attendance at school, and just certain things that concern them about the welfare.
So the suspicion could come there under the law. But would it, if it's not, it's suspicious for them, is not suspicious for all the children? Because it's the same condition.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're now trespassing, if you will, Mr. Sharp, on additional steps that certainly have to be examined very carefully in terms of how the matter is dealt with in a holistic way.
So it's an ongoing situation. The best care for the children are doing, but their need for sensitivity as it relates to the people and their choice of religion.
Sensitivity for all parties, actually, because if you even consider removing a child, even from the worst circumstances, if there's a loved one in that worst circumstance with the child, you have to think about the
impact of disengagement.
So,
and we're going to disengage for a little while, and we'll be right back on Insight. Diahann Gordon Harrison is the children's advocate, and we've been having a good conversation. A lot of insightful insights, if you may. But who is she? Where did she come from? Where was she born? Where were you born?
So I was born in St. Andrew at the Nuttall Memorial Hospital.
I tell you, you're not all baby.
Yes.
I won't ask you what year, because that's your prerogative. But you grew up where, or went to which school? And I don't start with high school, start from Miss Bailey's school.
Okay. No, well, actually, I'm an only child, right?
Yeah, no. Oh,
I'm an only child. Well, not spoiled. I'm loved and I am precious.
Okay, there you
and
go.
so I went to a nursery school, right? I don't remember the name of it.
That's right.
But I remember we had some
It'll make you draw.
little
And
orange bowls, and the porridge was lovely. And
Okay.
I loved porridge as a little girl, particularly cornmeal.
Okay.
So that was good. And then my mother is an educator, and she taught at the Otres Primary School for years, from before I was born. So my mother said, I need to keep you close to me. So instead of St. John's Prep, where I was supposed to go, I ended up at Otres Primary School.
And where? Which one? Otres Primary?
Yes, my mother's.
I pass it all the
that's
time,
that
yes.
my mother taught at.
Yes.
And that was a very nurturing environment, and it really was a fun place to be. I had a fun childhood.
And your mother taught there? At the same time you were going there?
Which is
It
why
was
I had
fun?
to go. Oh, of course.
but-
She was very smart, though, because I was never in her class.
Ah.
I was in the class of all her friends, which probably...
Better watch person.
Right.
Good.
But I had an excellent career, I thought. Graduated as valedictorian and went on to my first place. I did common entrance, of course.
Yes,
so that should give you an
I'm
idea
well
of my
familiar with
age.
that.
And so I placed at the Immaculate Conception High School.
Oh, that
which
school that will cause a lot of traffic. and
well,
constant
yes,
spray.
but
Yes.
the #1 girls' school then and now.
Yes.
And so I'm a proud graduate of Immaculate. Spent 7 years there. First to
So you
fifth
became
form
a
and
blue
then sixth
coat?
form. I did.
Yes.
I did sixth form 2 years. And then from there, I matriculated to the University of the West Indies, where I did a first degree in history and political science.
History.
And
Okay,
then
that's
I went on to do law. I was one of the what you would call the pressure cooker graduates, because I got accepted into law, and instead of doing the degree, the LLB, in 3 years, they said because of how well I'd done at my first degree, I was exempt from the first year. So I had to do it in 2 years. So I went straight to Barbados. And when everybody else for the first semester was doing 5 courses, I was doing 9.
Oh.
So it was a pressure cooker of a time,
Yes.
but a fabulous time. And enjoyed those years as well. Spent 2 years in Barbados and then came back to the Norman Manley Law School and graduated in the year 2000. The class of 2000.
Class of
the millennial
2000.
class. Yeah.
So you did all of that. What was it like? Who do you remember from your primary school, apart from your mother? And who do you remember in terms of that guidance, in terms of that influence, that impact?
Well, being a student who has a mother who is a senior teacher as a member of staff, the guidance really came from a lot of the teachers. I remember in particular my grade 6 teacher, who happened to be my godmother. She was, very nurturing. She had no children of her own, but was mother to many.
Yes.
And we shared a very special bond, of course. Then there was my grade 5 teacher as well, my grade 4 teacher, who is Mrs. Henlin. She is actually, well, at the time, she was the wife of the principal. And so there are so many persons that played and impacted in a very meaningful way on just how things ought to be done. So from very early, I understood, and I still use that as my mantra, that only your best is really good enough, and you always strive for perfection as far as that is humanly possible, because of course we're fallible.
So I hear.
So there will be times that we'll fall short.
Yes.
But for me, you really have to strive for that.
Yes.
And I mean, it really would be remiss of me not to just say make it very clear that the 2 stalwarts who continue to be like these superhuman people in my eyes and my life really are my parents.
Really?
They're still alive, still
You haven't
married.
spoken about Daddy yet. You tell me
And,
your
yes.
mother is a
Well, no,
senior teacher, and you just play down the father thing. And,
No, never, never. As I said, I am an only child, and you know what they say about girls and their fathers.
Ah, yes.
And to this day, I speak to my parents, both my parents, every single day, whether I'm in the country or not.
So they are in St. Anne?
Yes, yes.
What
yes.
part of St. Anne, without giving away too much address?
Well, actually on the border. So our family home is in Tower Isle, pretty close to Couples Hotel.
St. Mary there.
Right, right on the border. So that's where home is. But everything else is done in St. Anne, because my mother is originally from Ocherius, as they would say, right under the clock.
You know Colgate?
So, yes. In fact, in the old days, when we had to drive through Fern Gully, I would pass Colgate, because being a student in Kingston,
That's
it meant
right.
I had to come down every Friday and go back in every Sunday. So that, is a community that I certainly would have passed through quite a bit.
I just asked for personal reasons.
I'm
but
sure I'm picking it up at a St. Anne connection, maybe.
That is correct.
Yes,
That's correct.
Yes, yes.
You went to UWI. Give me who stood out there for you.
Okay, so UWI was a different kind of affair, because you got the feeling very early that you were now responsible for your education. You didn't have teachers anymore who expected you to come to class.
Yeah.
It was a given. You come if you want to come. We're here giving the learning. If you want it, you come.
Up to you.
But there were certain lecturers that stood out. For example, Professor Stephen Vassiani. I did international law with him. And Professor Trevor Monroe, as I said, I have a minor in political science.
Yes.
So he in the Department of Government was one of those lecturers that stood out. And in terms of the history side of it, there is this lecturer that I had. I'll never forget her. Her name was Sultana Afraz. And she was from Pakistan, I believe. And so if you know anything about the culture of Pakistanis, they're very to the letter, very precise. Things must be done in a certain order and so on. And that was her. And many persons thought that she was almost dictatorial in her approach. But there was a very sweet side to her that I had the benefit of being exposed to and being drawn into that. So that was particularly
Let me segue now into, so you come out of school and you look at work.
Yes.
So where you get the first work?
Well, funny enough, I had my sights on the Attorney General's chambers.
Ooh,
Because I
okay.
said, not sure about this criminal law thing. Can't imagine being in court with somebody accused of killing 10 people and then I have to either defend them or
Yes,
prosecute them
yes.
and so on. And as it turns out, when I was called for the interview for the Attorney General's chambers, I was traveling. I was overseas having a great time because law school finished,
Yes,
so
yes,
you're
yes.
having a good time. And fast forward to a couple of weeks later, I was interviewed and I was assigned as a prosecutor as my first outing
Yes.
as practicing counsel and as assigned to St. Anne.
St. Anne,
Yes, so that
funny,
was
that
quite
should-
a happy coincidence.
Yes.
And so I did, in fact, have my first sojourn in the law as a criminal attorney. And I did that for a solid 12 years and enjoyed it thoroughly. Yes.
As a prosecution?
Yes, so
Okay.
I did all of the juicy murders
Yeah.
and the rapes and the robberies and the money laundering and the embezzlement and the gun crimes and the drugs
Yes.
and all of these things, yes.
And then?
And then, fast forward to 2012, when I transitioned, having acted as Senior Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions at the Office of the DPP for years, I moved from that to assume the current role that I have in 2012 as Children's Advocate.
Who called you? Did they, hunt you? How did that work?
Well, let's just say that several things aligned very nicely, and the opportunity presented itself. It embraced me, and I embraced it right back.
You like poetry. It embraced me. So you embrace because you have your names of an embracing feature to it. How did that go?
My names, let's be a little bit clearer about the question.
Diahann,
Yes,
Gordon.
yes.
Were you born Gordon Harrison?
No.
No,
I was
that's the
born
embrace.
I just wanted to be clear where we're going.
That's
Yes.
the embrace.
Yes, so yes, I am married. My husband is Dirk Harrison.
I
And,
know him.
Yes, yes. And, we've been married for, oh my goodness, it's been a long time, 2003 to now. So that's 16 years. We celebrated 16 years this year.
You met him at the office?
No, I didn't meet him at the office. I met him before the office.
Before the office,
Yes,
okay.
Yes,
Offsprings?
yes. We have 4 beautiful children. A perfect pair, I like to call it, because we have 2 boys, and then we followed that up with 2 girls.
Okay.
So, yes.
And what's your greatest moment in your job to date? When you think of your job
Yes.
that just gets you going?
All right. The greatest moment, I think it's 2 significant things that have nicely wedded together. One, that I get the opportunity to serve in this capacity and to be a part of what are serious protective mechanisms for our children. And when I see that now actualized in the eyes of a child who we have helped, and especially if they come back to say, this is what is happening with me now. If it weren't for this, I wouldn't be here. So that satisfaction that you have impacted even one life, and you see the spark coming back and the hope, that for me is magic.
Well, we want to thank you, as I would say in the Army and in the police. Thank you for your service. And it appears as if you have a long more years to go. What's the next pivotal move you'd like to see happen for children? I mean, here's one question that I want. You can have sex at 16 or 17, but yet the age and the adult don't align.
Right, I agree with you. In fact, if you were following some submissions I made to the Houses of Parliament, in fact to the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, that was one battle that I think I was the lone voice in the wilderness saying that we need to align. Children are children. If they can't do certain things until 18, how in God's name are they to make sensible decisions that can have lifelong consequences, health and baby,
Yes.
at 16? Unfortunately, I was not successful on that because our parliament still believes that the age of consent should continue to be 16.
I wouldn't say plague on their houses, but I'll just say thank you for being here, and all the best.
Thank you so
It really
much
was
for
my
having me.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Indeed it
Pleasure
was.
was mine.
And I want to thank her. And if you don't know, if you have any children, they can find her at the Air Jamaica building on Harper Street.
And
Yes,
online.
Air Jamaica doesn't fly anymore, but the building is still Air Jamaica building. And that's where the office is. And they take up legal cases having to do with children, and it's pro bono,
Yes.
for free. No, it's not for free. The state pays for it. But until next time, Michael Sharp wishing you pleasant viewing.